There's a reason why Okinawa is often spoken of separately from Japan. Many who don't necessarily know the full story can easily hear the Japanese islands and Okinawa spoken of differently. The climate, culture, and people are vastly different from the Japanese themselves. Because Okinawa was once its own country, and also a vassal state of both China and Japan, before in modern times it was annexed into present-day Japan. The Japanese government doesn't want the truth to be known outside of Japan because it might complicate the political system that it's always had with the small region. The forgotten history. Even among modern Okinawans, a good number of them don't exactly know who they are because they've been under generations of Japanese assimilation. Even before that, there was murky aspects of the exact history of the islands. Geographically close to both China and Japan, it's been influenced by both nations for countless centuries. Okinawa was actually historically more influenced arguably by China, who often had imperial envoys to the islands. The Chinese claimed the islands more than once during its dynastic history, and because Okinawa was so small, the Chinese never actually had to enforce its claim. The people just accepted nominal Chinese rule, or quasi-autonomy within the reigning Chinese dynasty. Though at the most early periods of the time, claims are that it developed similar to Japan's earliest period of the Jomon era. Nothing more uniquely Okinawan would emerge for thousands of years. The similarity in prehistorical contact with Japan would be the basis for claims of annexation later in the modern era. The first real claims of a modern Okinawa were from the 1300s, with the native Okinawans referring to their domain as the Ryu-Kyu Islands, perhaps based off a Chinese name for the islands known as the Liu-Chu. At the time, three small kingdoms battled for control over one another and control of all the Ryu-Kyu Islands. The Okinawans refer to this period of their history as the Three Kingdoms period, with the said kingdoms being the Hokuzan, Chuzan, and Nanzan. The constant fighting and bickering arguably had the Ryu-Kyu warriors being the equal of the feudal samurai in terms of ferocity and courage. The Chinese historical claims date from the year of 1392 and shortly thereafter. The Ryu-Kyu lord sent a request for Chinese technological assistance and good relations. China responded by giving technology and immigration to the Ryukyus. At the request of the Ryu-Kyu king, the Hongwu emperor of the Ming dynasty sent 36 families from Fujian province to help with agriculture. Ryu-Kyu officials of high status up until the Japanese annexation can trace their family lineage to these original families who came from China through Fujian. Before this period, there was never any real unified Ryu-Kyu, and each region of modern Okinawa was administered by its own feudal method of government. The original Japanese claim to the islands was in the year of 1609, when the southern Japanese samurai domain of Satsuma, through circumstances, invaded and conquered it, turning it into a vassal state of the Satsuma clan when it was already a tributary state to China. Modern Japan used this claim as a basis for annexation. Though after the occupation by Satsuma, it was still recognized as an independent kingdom and tributary of China. Occasionally, it would be considered a Japanese possession through Satsuma, and with this accidental grouping with Japan, would eventually lead to the Japanese themselves assuming that they would control Okinawa and later come and expect it to be part of their territory. When Japan was modernizing itself in the 1800s to compete with and counter European colonialism, Japan would once again look to the Ryukyu as an extension of Japanese influence, in the islands being a strategic location between the Chinese mainland and modern-day Taiwan, which was another island that Japan aspired to obtain. Meiji Japan and Qing China clashed over the islands within the mid-1800s, and though Japan was growing in strength, they were still hesitant to annex Ryukyu outright. Satsuma renamed the Ryu-Kyu dominion as Okinawa, with a variation of the Okinawan terms for themselves, and to this day, it's still how the islanders refer to themselves. Japan sought to gain Western favor by using diplomatic means, and even asked the United States of America in 1879 for assistance. The American plan was to actually split the islands, with the northern ones going to Japan and the southern ones going to China. Neither side agreed to these terms, and the status quo remained in force. Japan had actually reorganized Okinawa into regional prefectures as far back as 1872, before finally being annexed in 1879, against all wishes by the Americans, Chinese, and Okinawans themselves. To solidify the Japanese grip on Okinawa, the last king of the Ryu-Kyu kingdom was transported to Japan to live out the rest of his life and given Japanese peerage to publicly and politically connect Okinawa to Imperial Japan. The denied history. After Okinawa was annexed into Japan, the Okinawans were immediately not told about the situation that they were now in. At the time, even with the Japanese integration, they either saw themselves as uniquely different from the Japanese or more Chinese due to the ancient ties from Ming China through the Fujian province. While Meiji Japan was mostly urbanized or even fully modernized, or in the process of modernizing with westernized with technology, culture, and attitudes, Okinawa was actually left rural and outdated. Some actually saw this done on purpose because if Okinawa was actually ever let go or declared independence, with possible help from China or America, the situation within the islands would not have it necessarily favorable for the locals if such a thing was to actually occur. Aspects of the Okinawan language, culture, and customs were put out of favor with the preference for being that of the Japanese language, culture, customs, and attitudes. Within the Ryu-Kyu, there were actually regional dialects of their language. There was never any uniform language that all of the people on the islands viewed or felt as their own. The Shuri-Nara dialect could be viewed as a language that was mostly used throughout the majority of the islands, due to Shuri and Nara being large communities within the Ryukyu. From the Japanese point of view, the Okinawan language is actually classified as the Okinawan dialect of Japanese. While the native Okinawan language does have traits from Southern Japanese, it's not necessarily fair or enough to classify it only as a variant of Japanese. After the Ryukyu kingdom was annexed by Satsuma, in terms of a written language, the shift to Japanese kanji was enforced, but documents were still allowed to be written in classical Chinese to avoid any unwanted problems with China. Ryukyu culture was arguably kept mostly intact until after Meiji Japan sought to reinforce its hold on the old Satsuma-held islands. Even after the takeover, the Okinawan people still wrote with and used their own script both publicly and privately until the 1800s. After 1879, when Okinawa was officially annexed, the islands underwent major changes and underwent strict Japanese assimilation. Okinawan culture in terms of mythology were also different from Japan. One striking difference is that in terms of spiritual power, women were seen as superior to men. This belief culminated in a class of priestesses and mediums. One sad fact is in modern times, most Okinawans of the younger generation don't necessarily have a desire to learn the original Okinawan language. Most within the prefecture today actually speak an Okinawan Japanese Creole hybrid language. Elders from before the Second World War mostly spoke Okinawan with aspects of Japanese borrowed. With Okinawa under Japanese control in the early 20th century, Okinawans brought with them their martial arts from the islands. Because of the fact that Okinawa was now part of Japan, many Okinawans came to mainland Japan in terms of a better life and work. Owing as much to the ferocity of the Ryu-Kyu fighters, the Japanese took notice of one of these arts, karate. This Okinawan art actually has origins with the Fujian white crane stance, once again owing to the Fujian connection to Okinawa. Systematically taught in Japan from the 1920s onwards, the Okinawans would not like the fact that their martial art was used by Japanese soldiers during their conquest of Asia. It has been said that due to the skill and impact of karate used by the Japanese, it helped them to conquer lands when their weapons could not do the job. During the Second World War, the Battle of Okinawa was among the most vicious of the Pacific Campaign. When the Americans invaded, it was the first time Japanese territory had been seized and successfully taken in hundreds of years. Again, due to the fact that Okinawa had not been modernized by Japan, the sieges during the Battle of Okinawa were unusually difficult and terrain was hard to advance through. The Japanese soldiers also executed anyone speaking the Okinawan language as well. As a result, a lot of civilians were butchered, and it's estimated that nearly 150,000 civilians and Okinawan conscripted soldiers died during the battle out of the estimated 300,000 pre-war population. But Okinawa would be seized and kept under American possession until 1972. The censored history. The American and Chinese governments actually discussed the concept of returning Okinawa to Chinese control after Japan was defeated in the war. These plans were made during the war and predicted the outcome of what was to occur. However, even though the Chinese desired the islands back, they had too much to deal with at that moment to actually want the islands back officially. So after the war, they were solely under American possession. Towards the end of the Second World War, the Japanese government would warn the Okinawans of what would happen if the foreigners were to seize control, such as the women being raped, the men being beaten, and the children with the elderly being ignored and not cared for. There was well-known footage of Okinawan women and girls committing suicide by leaping from cliffs overlooking the sea just as the American forces advanced, and instances of other women taking grenades with them into caves and setting them off, thus blowing themselves to pieces. When the Americans did come, the Okinawans were shocked that the foreigners were not as ruthless as the Japanese claimed that they would be. The Okinawans would then realize the truth and that they were lied to and disliked the Japanese even more. The American government would administer Okinawa from 1950 to 1972. It was during this time that the United States would upgrade the badly outdated and feudalistic infrastructure within Okinawa and do much to help the native people. But the gratitude from the Okinawans was short-lived, as soon they discovered that the laws the American soldiers and servicemen abided by were different from that of the Okinawans themselves. Okinawa was and still is a strategic set of islands off the coast of China. It was the main reason why the Japanese annexed the islands to begin with. Today, it's still wondered why the United States Army still maintains facilities on the islands of Okinawa. It's estimated that most of the habitable land within the islands are mostly American used. The laws are intentionally vague as to a serviceman can be implicated as to a said crime, which is often, at various times, young women are kidnapped and raped, soldiers get drunk and vandalize or damage property, or military aircraft accidentally malfunction and crash within the region. It was originally thought that once the American control lapsed in 1972, that the Okinawans would gain their freedom, as there were local movements and protests for an independent Okinawa. Instead, the Americans gave control back to Japan, which was a move protested by the local Okinawan and Chinese governments. Even now, there are still smaller movements for Okinawan independence, but the most urgent problem is the American military presence within the islands. It's known that due to the constant American military presence there, that is the most polluted and underdeveloped region of Japan. And out of all of the American military presences in all of Asia besides the Philippines is within Okinawa. However, the protests from Okinawa as well as Japan are finally being heard, and the United States military is finally starting to leave Okinawa, as plans have been implemented to shift troops to the Philippines, Guam, Saipan, and Australia. Mostly, this has to do with American weakening in the early 21st century and China's rise once again as the most powerful Asian nation. Okinawa isn't expected to gain independence once the Americans finally leave, rather just go back to the situation that it was with Japan before the Second World War. Perhaps the people of the islands can someday have an aspect of peace and regain the respect and dignity that they so rightfully deserve.